Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for being so patient. We're sorry that we had a slight delay here. We did have some of those inevitable technical problems, but we're very glad that you can join us today for our webinar with Michele Roberts. Unfortunately, Richard Moore will not be with us today, but we're still looking forward to a really great webinar called We Speak for Ourselves, EJ Community Voices Reforming Chemical Policies. And this is the Great Lakes Green Chemistry Network and Michigan Green Chemistry Clearinghouse webinar. I'm Lynn Katz-Cherry, and Clinton Boyd is also on from the Michigan Green Chemistry Clearinghouse. Well, our speaker today has a long history of working on environmental justice, and I'm going to let her tell you mostly about her background and what her organization is about, but Michele is well known for her work in helping the community of Mossville, Louisiana, which is a EJ community on the fence line, which has been fighting for many years to get in their struggle with the chemical companies and to be relocated to save their community. Now she has been working lately on chemicals policy and on a variety of different communities, fence line communities and other communities who are struggling against all kinds of infringement of their communities by different sources of chemical contamination. So I'm going to let her take it away. And thank you so much for being here today, Michele. I know that you have a crazy busy schedule, and we really appreciate your taking the time to be with us today.
Thank you, Lynn, and thank you, everyone, joining us on this webinar today. Again, in apologizing for our delay and the technical glitches that we had. My name is Michele Roberts. I am the National Co-Coordinator for the Environmental Justice and Health Alliance for Chemical Policy Reform. The other National Co-Coordinator is Richard Moore. I am based out of Washington, D.C., and Richard Moore is based out of Albuquerque, New Mexico. Richard is also with the Jardines Institute, the Jardines Institute, and the Jardines Institute is one of the affiliate members of the Environmental Justice and Health Alliance for Chemical Policy Reform. As we move forward, I will refer to our alliance as the EJHA. And the EJHA is a network of grassroots groups and organizations throughout the country. We're located primarily we're up to 12 states, and there's over 30 groups located in those 12 states where we build to advocate for more just and chemical policy reform to better protect environmental justice communities. These communities, for the most part, like as you heard Lynn mention, have been living frontline to many of our egregious chemical industries and the oil and gas industry as well. In fact, just this past weekend, and that was one of the things that I had to do just a few moments before joining this call, was actually taking a delegation called Movement Affected by the Dams. We just actually dropped them off at the Albuquerque airport because they were here for a 2-week or 3-week almost tour of the United States, trying to meet with communities who were impacted by big energy issues. If we start at the very beginning with the slides that we have, that I have for you, and also our website, just so that you know, is louisvillecharter.org. You can find more information about the Alliance on louisvillecharter.org. We go to the first slide. It's a very stark and dark and scary slide, if you will. This is the reason, for the most part, that our communities are working so very hard to reform toxic pollution. Unfortunately, across the United States, many communities are losing their communities. They're losing their health, their life, their land, and their culture to toxic pollution. And it is the law based on our environmental policies that we currently have in existence. And I just noticed the word reason is spelled wrong, and I apologize for that. Oh, Lord. What you see there on that slide is known as Morrisonville. That is a community that was formed by a freedman by the name of Jim Morrison in Louisiana along what is now called Louisiana's Cancer Alley. We call this Cancer Alley specifically because of the fact that along that region there are very high disproportionate impacts of toxic pollution that we know have been associated to various forms of cancer. Unfortunately, that is the Dow chemical facility that you see there behind the cemetery. That is what is left of that community. It is, at least we know of, 5 communities have been lost in the Gulf Coast region due to toxic chemicals, with one that we know, as Len mentioned earlier, the Mossville community quickly becoming number 6. Right now, the Mossville community is actually in a relocation, a voluntary buyout discussion right now as we speak, negotiation with a South African company known as Sasol. They're building the largest cracker that we know ever in the United States in Mossville for the natural gas industry. We go to the next slide. This next slide was actually taken from the American Chemistry Council. When you look at this slide, this is the elephant in the room, if you will, and I want to take a pause back and say we are very grateful for networks such as yours who are actually pushing and advocating for green chemistry. Because one thing that we must make clear that was made mention with the environmental justice movement back in 1991 at the first People of Color Summit, where we redefined what environment was as to that of where we work, where we play, where we pray, where we recreate. It is everything to us. And at that particular time, at that convening, also what came to be is that we know that we must be able to, have jobs to employ our, to take care of our families and the likes thereof. And so what we have been calling for since the evolution of the environmental justice movement, if you will, is that of green chemistry, safe, affordable technologies and practices, if you will, to better protect communities and workers. And we know that it will also impact that of economics in a positive, not a negative way. So when we look at this challenge here, the challenge that we have before us is the fact that the American Chemistry Council is seeking to grow this energy chain in so many ways that it has impacted everything that we do in our lives, which is why it's very important for networks like yours that are actually countering these pieces, and also where and when possible, proving the fact that we can indeed change our system to that of reflecting that of a more precautionary-based system, as opposed to, if you look at this challenge that we have set before us that the American Chemistry Council set up, we basically have set our laws and our policies, if you will, to be a regime that responds to risk as opposed to a regime that is based on precaution. And so that said, communities of color and that of the poor in Appalachia and others have been calling for a more precautionary-based regime. Can you take us to the next slide, please? So in the next slide, we see that now, and this is yet another issue that came up as we were with our Brazilian friends this past weekend as well, and we took them to different parts of New Mexico here up in the northern part where they are indeed grappling with fracking, that of that of uranium and molybdenum mining and what have you. Brazil is also telling us that they too are being faced with egregious fracking, the gas exploration of fracking. According to them, they are saying that this is something that has also been pushed by the United States multinationals. And this particular slide shows us where throughout the country communities are threatened by the U.S. shale gas exploration. We can go to the next slide, please. So what is it that environmental justice communities need to make sure that their communities are made whole? These are some of the points that the communities are calling from with respect to that of addressing the Toxic Substance Control Act. Ever since that act was authored in 1976, it never really, while people were celebrating the bicentennial, as we lovingly say, you know, we were celebrating the bicentennial of this country and then giving an open door to chemicals at the same time and a pass to all those that have already been here. And today, as we speak, 86,000 chemicals are on the market. Children are born, our babies are born with at least over 200 chemicals in their systems as they come through their mother's womb. Now, that's just on the general average American or average person residing in this country. Think about the fact of these particular chemical and oil and gas facilities now being located in communities and therefore providing that of a more egregious impact on health, such as a case in point Mossville, where the Mossville community actually allowed for the United States government to test their blood and urine, only to find out that they had 3 times the amount of dioxin in their blood, their urine, and in attic dust. And why? Because of the fact that their community, only 5.5 square miles, is actually surrounded by 14 of the most toxic, egregious facilities ever. And now, as I shared with you earlier on, the number 15 is Sasol, building the largest ethylene oxide cracker ever. In the face of all of that, I should say in the shadows of all of that, we have a deeply flawed toxic chemical policy that allows for all of these pieces to come through. So as we're thinking about even this evolution of, or we should say not evolution because it's happened since 1948 with fracking, we should say the egregious advancement of fracking, if you will, all of the many chemicals and all of the thousands of gallons of water that is used and millions in some points we've learned here in New Mexico in some points it could take 5 to 9 million gallons of water for one fracking site. And so when we look at our chemical policies with respect to the actual activities that are going on, there is no protection in no way if we look at those who are in most harm's way. And so what communities of color and the poor have been calling for in TSCA, if you will, is to define and protect vulnerable populations. There's language about vulnerable populations in that bill, but we don't consider environmental justice communities vulnerable because of the fact that there was an injustice made to these communities that now placed them in harm's way. Vulnerable populations are those who cannot do for themselves, the children and the elderly. And so therefore there's no clear definition as to whether environmental justice communities will even be protected in that of the Toxic Substance Control Act. And it is a clear indication given the fact that the language of hotspots and the protection of civil rights and that of establishing timelines and all of those other things are not in the bill. More important, the fact of a system and a process for laying out how it is we incorporate that of safe alternatives. None of that language is in TSCA. So if we can go to the next slide. This is a slide of the Houston Ship Channel. Again, as we said, another flaw that we have in all of our policies is that multiple cumulative and synergistic impacts, as you all know, are not factored in, and therefore creating a deeper vulnerability zone. And so therefore we have placed people in harm's way, made them more vulnerable by the number of facilities and activities that are going on in their very presence. Again, we defined environmentalism as where we work, where we play, where we worship, where we learn, all these things. So we have children going to school in less than a mile radius of these particular facilities. In fact, this particular slide right here, the #1 school in #1 harm's way, if you will, in the country is located right in this area. And to add insult to injury, it's a school that was named after Cesar Chavez. When the community leader, Juan Perez, the community of the Texas Environmental Justice Advisory Services, when those folks organized and tried to push back, they placed an air monitor there, named the air monitor Chavez, and was actually they felt that Juan was unappreciative, if you will, because of the fact that he would not show up for the ribbon cutting ceremony, because as Juan said, he wanted the school closed and not an air monitor placed there because of the fact that the children cannot learn in this space. Next slide. This is yet another indication of degradation. This is in the Arctic. This is revealing our military secrets in the Arctic. As the permafrost is melting, we are seeing more and more military toxics. And in addition to that, dioxin is actually traveling up on tailwinds and now impacting that of Alaskan Native. Next slide. Kelly Air Force Base, another. Next slide. Uranium legacies, such as what we see here in the U.S., in the Southwest, and just last week, the Chevron mine just announced here at the Quesla mine up in just north of town that they were closing the mine, thereby now over 300 workers have lost their jobs. According to the Chevron mine, they're saying that China now has cornered the market on molybdenum, and this is why they're moving out. But But the issue that we have is they have severely contaminated the water several years ago. They've had major contamination there. And so now with this recent announcement of closing the mine, the communities there are now subjected to shifting and pushing for cleanup and health, to which we're hoping that this can be the case. Next slide. This is Appalachia. We are still dealing with the issues on the ground in Charleston, West Virginia. This was something that could have definitely been prevented. And then to add insult to injury, Freedom Industries actually went bankrupt at the end. Just after, days after the disaster. Next slide. This shows you down in the Texas colonias where they are doing deep well injection and have ruined the water so much that people are actually creating, the colonias are actually creating shrines to water. Next slide. Food. We have also are now grappling in our communities with respect to food security is too an environmental justice, all by these multinational corporations doing these egregious acts of the most dirtiest energy possible. Next slide. So which brings us to the chemical disaster work, to which the Environmental Justice and Health Alliance has taken on a huge role in with the Prevention of Chemical Disasters National Coalition that includes groups such as environmental groups such as Greenpeace, labor groups such as the Steelworkers and the Blue-Green Alliance. Also, it includes health folks and others. And together we were able to push and get the Obama administration to author up the Executive Order 16350, to which came with listening sessions across the country, and whereby which our communities as well as industry and others were there actually submitting recommendations that we need to be able to implement Section 112R of the General Duty Clause, which calls for safe alternatives and creating a process to institute that of a safe alternative technological process, not just chemicals, but also the process in and of itself, speaking back to that of that multiple cumulative synergistic piece, understanding the fact that we have community areas such as the Houston Ship Channel that has no zoning practices, taking into account the fact that people need to be relocated if indeed they are in harm's way, and be able to have the financial compensation that is necessary for them to move and live and be healthy and whole. Also understanding and taking into account the fact that we are now utilizing rail to port systems to transport some of these tar sands and other things in this, quote, new economy and new big energy. We are happy to report that on this past Friday, the Obama administration issued their report in response to all of that process. And we're very happy to report the fact that the lead came, in their lead report to the stakeholders on the call Friday, they spoke to the need of incorporating an integrated safe technology approach. They spoke to the need of taking precaution. They spoke to the need of minimizing and reducing the risk in the vulnerable zones, all of which our collective in EJHA as well as the national collective have been pushing for. Now, will it happen today? No, it won't. Will there be devils in the details? Yes, it will. According to the administration, however, they said that they are pushing for guidance, standards, and regulations to be in place by 2016 by the time the administration leaves the White House. Next slide, please. This also shows, this is Louisville, Kentucky, showing another way in which John F. Kennedy School, no doubt, elementary school, and you see what's in the background, these rails, these rail cars. And if you look beyond those clump of trees and rail cars and across the river, we're looking across the river to Lynn and her folks in Indiana. Next slide. We see how in Appalachia the coexistence of coal and chemical plants breed to higher hazards. Next slide. Our children are playing right next to these places. Let's go to the next slide. This is showing where I'm originally from, Wilmington, Delaware, the Vice President, actually Joe Biden. And in this particular port, at the Port of Wilmington, they recently, within the past few years, dredged and widened the port. And in fact, communities are constantly being flooded. There are a community called Southbridge, which is an environmental justice community. The next slide. Here we have, this is showing how our children are actually, this is in Norcross, showing that when these disasters take place in the disaster zones, our folks are told to shelter in place. So, you know, oftentimes they're not able to leave from their spaces. The next slide. The BP oil drilling disaster where we had 15 deaths. Next slide, additional threats. Now, this particular, this is in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and there was a time that this particular junkyard burned. They said that this salvage yard burned for 3 days. Now, think about the fact that it has the fluids, brake fluids, all those other things are in the cars. Now, also in addition to other stressors in communities, in environmental justice communities. All of these things led us to the very next slide, a collaborative report that we are happy to say that we work together along with the Environmental Justice Health Alliance, the Coming Clean Collective, and Paul Oram, a fantastic individual who we looked at 3,443 facilities across the United States and actually looked at who's in danger. The methodology and used with that, we incorporated that of the census, our most recent census information. And from this report is showing who's in danger with respect to facilities, those who are living fence line to these facilities, and within the vulnerability zones. Even 20 years later, after the Toxic Waste and Race report, it still shows that race and class are still a factor. It showed in this report that 60 in these vulnerability zones, first of all, we have 148 million people living in harm's way. Of those 148 million, 3.8 million live fence line. Those folks that are living fence line, 60% of the U.S. population of those folks. Excuse me, let me back up. 75% are black, African American. 60% are Latino. 75% black, 60% Latino. The other factor is economics. Take us to the next slide, which shows us the report findings. So therefore, it is showing that race is still a factor. Take us to the next slide. What do we need now to do? So in speaking for ourselves, we are calling on this administration to make information on chemical hazards and alternatives widely available. Going back to what the administration announced on Friday in their report back to the public, this is what they're reporting they are going to do, they're pushing for. We also want to ensure that communities and workers are fully engaged in the prevention planning. Going back to what the Obama administration referenced the other day on Friday, according to them, they will be diligently working with communities and workers as we move forward in addressing this chemical secure disaster response, reforming the policies. The last, require companies, and this is where folks like you all come in, and we're so happy that you all are in existence, require companies to assess whether they could use safer chemicals or processes and require them to convert whenever safe alternatives are feasible and affordable. This has been our theme song, if you will, for lack of better words, throughout the listening session process. We have stuck to these 3 bullets as the Environmental Justice and Health Alliance, as well as our national coalition. We're also happy to report that we being the Environmental Justice and Health Alliance, when this report was released, May 1st, we met with the administrator, Gina McCarthy, on April 30th and presented, she had 20 of her senior staff members there from across the agency there, to which we delivered the report to them, to which we also called for the same thing. The Office of Pollution and Prevention and the office that Jim Jones and the folks that handle green chemistry and all the others were in the room. We're happy to report, and we did push for that. She told us that she wanted to come out into communities to actually respond to this work. She also told us that she will be responding to all of the recommendations, whether she agreed with them or not. She would be responding in writing to the Environmental Justice and Health Alliance with respect to that. And again, we made a strong demand for that of the incorporation of green chemistry. And with that, I will stop there and thank you all for your great work and take any questions and comments that you all have to share.
Thank you so much, Michele. That was really interesting. And we do have some questions. And I also wanted to tell people that the link to your report is available right now on our website, www.glgc.org. Right at the bottom of the announcement about this webinar, you can find a link. And also you can find it at www.louisvillecharter.org. Is that right, Michele?
That's right, Lynn. And if I can also say, we are also happy to report, which our Brazilian friends were happy to know, we are also happy to report that the report has been fully translated into Spanish. It's being laid out right now as we speak, and so it will be soon available, the entire report in Spanish translation as well.
And will that be on the Louisville Charter site?
Yes, it will. Yes, it will.
Okay, so let's get into some questions here. Regarding endocrine disrupting chemicals, how are the communities that are losing male population with such gender affecting chemicals, how are the communities that are losing male population coping with such gender affecting chemicals, and how are they being helped? This has been reported in Canada as far as I know.
Yeah, you know, we do have, I do know folks up in Alaska. Pam Miller has been doing the Alaska Community Action on Toxics. They've been doing some great work with respect to that, and actually have been doing a lot of work in the United Nations system, in the international system, and dropping that down into making the connection into our state and local systems as well. So that situation is actually being dealt with, and I should say in the Alliance, the group that has been taking the lead on doing that work is the ACAT folks up out of Alaska.
So this, we We have a number of interesting questions from the same person. Does environmental impact assessment really help in situations where impacts keep changing from time to time?
Does environmental impact assessment really help? Well, you know, see, again, that's a tricky question. That's a very interesting question. And,
yeah.
you know, yeah, and so it depends, because I'll give you an example. Again, going back to the case of Mossville, Louisiana. You know, Mossville, we use environmental impact assessments. We use the government's data, and we produced a document called what was it, the Mossville Environmental Action Now, where they use the government's own data, and where I referenced the information about the high levels of dioxin in the blood of the Mossville residents. We were able to show the direct causality and linkages. Wilma Subra, beautiful, brilliant, MacArthur genius, was able to show direct causality linked to PPG and ConocoPhillips. But what happened was that the government wound up doing a finger-pointing game with one another. EPA, you know, we go to ATSDR and say, look, you have the data, you have all the information necessary to tell EPA to that these folks need to change their way of doing things. And then EPA says, oh, well, ATSDR should say it. ATSDR is like, well, EPA should do it. So, you know, you get the information, and then you get caught up in the vicious government vacuum cycle, if you will.
Yeah. I think that's really difficult, and also the impact statements, the impact assessments, I think take a very long time to happen. And
absolutely,
you know,
absolutely, absolutely, they take a very long time to happen. And then, you know, many of our communities, they have very, very, very limited resources.
Yeah.
And equally the same of capacity.
Yeah.
And so that becomes a huge challenge as well.
Yeah. So I want to see if we can get in some other questions here. You did not mention the release of diesel from backup engines at data centers. Are you aware of this issue in Quincy, Washington? Hispanics are mostly affected, as well as farmers in general.
You know, we are aware of the diesel situation. Unfortunately, we just are not fully working on that right now. We are aware of it. So, you know, for the most part, the way we work on the national policies, but we're also working locally with the as we said, we have over 30, we're up to over 30 grassroots communities now. But even our capacity, if you will, Richard Moore and I are co-work group leaders, if you will, for the Coming Clean Collective. So it's a very, you know, we have to, unfortunately, as much as we try, we can't cover everything as possible.
And you do an awful lot. I can vouch for that. What's the timeline for EPA's accountability to your request?
What's the timeline for EPA's accountability to request for?
I guess, yeah. I guess that's for the issues that you raised. For
the chemical disaster. Well, we do know for the, okay, so we do know on Friday, a couple of things happened. On Friday, according to the administration, they are going to become, they being like EPA officials and others, will be coming out into communities. They've actually already contacted the environmental justice. They contacted Richard Moore and I to be able to, they want the Environmental Justice and Health Alliance to be a significant of significant assistance with helping to identify where it is they can come out and meet with our communities, number one. Number two, there is going to be, according to EPA, there will be an announcement. This process will start off with an announcement, if you will, regarding creating any type of guidelines and regulations with respect to the chemical disaster work, excuse me, chemical security work. And then they also have apparently throughout the lead agencies, and the lead agencies on this work being EPA, OSHA under the Department of Labor, and Homeland Security, they have tasked their senior level officials to continue the work in the interagency working group. And we're also looking at inclusion of communities and workers in that interagency working group process. And so according to the administration, their timeline is that as they leave in 2016, that we should have guidance and regulations and standards in place that speak to that of at least trying to make sure that we do not have experience another West Texas or experience another Chevron explosion, according to that.
Thanks. So I have a good question for you. Person asks, the issue ultimately seems to be lack of political will. How can the common man help? This is the way they phrase the question. Can someone empower people to encourage better political policies?
Yes, absolutely. You know, it's that is one of the things, and this is where the Brazilians who were with us this past weekend really appreciated the work that we did this past weekend in connecting them to local communities even here in New Mexico. And they weren't just here in New Mexico. Over the course of this past couple of weeks, they were in New York. They had participated in the Left Forum and other spaces. But I know for a fact with the Environmental Justice, and I think Lynn can attest to this, with the Environmental Justice and Health Alliance for Chemical Policy Reform, these are your everyday folks who, you know, have just, they've said enough is enough. And even someone like the Mossville community, I mean, I look at all the community folks and all the everyday folks in the Environmental Justice and Health Alliance, I just look at these folks in awe because of the fact that they are living everyday lives. They are grandmothers. They are children. They are young people. They are moms and dads and what have you. And everyone is united in pushing not only at the federal level but at the local level. So they are challenging their local levels, and they have even, you know, as we said, we're working on a multiplicity of things, from that of the personal care products to flame retardants to that of this chemical disaster and TSCA. Now think about this. This is your everyday folks that are actually pushing this. We actually got bisphenol A, the BPA, and these plastics, and the whole conversation. That conversation and all those things happen because of everyday people. And so therefore we can actually address this through our purchasing power, through our organizing power, through challenging our local elected officials on up to our federal levels, and vice versa.
I want to thank you so much for this wonderful presentation, Michele.